Hi guys. So when improvising, a lot of us tend to play quite linearly. We start on a note and then move up and down and up and down and so on, either using scales or arpeggios. Now this is fine, especially when you're first starting out, but eventually this kind of linear soloing will start to sound a little bit boring, a little bit stale, a little bit too polished and smooth, and a bit unimaginative. Another way of saying this is that the melodic contour is too smooth. Now, the melodic contour is simply the general shape of your improvised line. So really, when we say your melodic contour is too smooth, we're really saying that the intervals between the notes in your improvisation are too small. So to make our solo more interesting, we want to insert a few bigger jumps and leaps in between our smooth lines to create that bit of interest and contrast. This means we would introduce some jaggedness into our melodic contour. Now, a simple, effective, and quite commonly used way of doing this is with something called octave displacement or pivot arpeggios. All this involves is shifting a note in a linear phrase up or down an octave and continuing that phrase in that new octave. So we are literally displacing part of that phrase up or down an octave. So to demonstrate this, let's take a really simple example. Let's just take a 2-5-1 in C and just play the C major scale descending. Now obviously that's really boring. It's essentially just a scale run, and as you can see, the melodic contour also very smooth. Now to use octave displacement, we could take the note G and play it an octave higher and then continue our phrase until we hit the note C. Now that'll sound like this. So we are still playing the exact same notes in both phrases, but the second one sounds a little bit more interesting precisely because it has that big jump in the middle there where we displaced the note G by an octave and finished our phrase. So the melodic contour now has a kink in it, which makes it a little bit more interesting. Now this technique works best when the note you displace is on an offbeat and you displace in the opposite direction of your line. So in this example, we displaced the note G, which is on an offbeat, and the phrase was descending, so we displaced it up an octave. Now you can, of course, displace on the beat and in the same direction. That's fine, it just won't always sound as strong. And when we apply this technique to an arpeggio rather than a scale, some people call this a pivot arpeggio, because you literally pivot to a new octave in the middle of your arpeggio. For example, let's again take a 2-5-1 in C and just arpeggiate the chords. And now let's pivot those arpeggios or displace each of those arpeggios by an octave somewhere on an offbeat. So as you can see, without the pivot or displacement, the contour is quite smooth, and with the pivot, it becomes a bit more jagged and interesting. Now let's do one final example. Let's do a 2-5-1 lick in C. So first, it'll sound like this. Right, so this is a nice, simple-ish, relatively typical jazz lick. It combines arpeggios and tensions, so arpeggiating up to the ninth, for example, chromatic runs and enclosures, which is where before you hit your target note, you play the note either side of it. So before you land on the B, we played C, B flat, and then hit the B, which is the third of our G7 chord, on which we begin our arpeggio over the G7 chord. And then just a Lydian mode scale run over the C major 7 chord, finishing on the ninth. Right, so all very common techniques or ideas that you'll find in practically every, or at least the majority of jazz licks that you'll see out there. So even as it is kind of the original version, it already sounds quite nice and interesting enough, and even like this, it could pass as a half-decent jazz lick. But as you can see, the melodic contour is still quite smooth. We're essentially still going up and then down and then back up over those few bars. So now again, let's use some octave displacement or some pivot arpeggios to play all the exact same notes. Remember that, we're not actually changing any notes, so the lick is more or less the same. We're just displacing some of those notes by an octave to create some bigger jumps and some jaggedness in our melodic contour. So doing this will sound as follows. Cool, so that still sounds good, it still sounds fine, and it even sounds more interesting than the original lick because we're moving around a little bit more. But because we are occasionally jumping those bigger intervals in between our smooth, linear soloing stuff, it gives it a slightly more jagged feel and a slightly more interesting and contrasted sound. But otherwise, everything else is the same, right? All the notes are the same. We're still playing arpeggios and chromatic runs and using enclosure. We're still targeting guide tones or ninths or whatever at the end there. So harmonically, all the content is still exactly the same. It's just that melodically, because we've introduced some of those bigger jumps, it's a little bit more interesting and sophisticated. So try and introduce this technique into your own soloing. It's not difficult at all because, again, you're literally playing the exact same notes. You just need to adjust the fingering to make it playable. But otherwise, all the same improvisation ideas that I cover in many of my other lessons all still apply here. We've just introduced an occasional octave jump. Cool, and that's it, guys. Nice, simple concept for this lesson. See you next time. Bye.